Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Just a couple of housekeeping thoughts. We do not have a quorum at this point, nor do we have someone from the city, which means that, oh, yay!
Do you know like the Beatles?
He was waiting for that.
That's right. All right.
That's a way to make an entrance.
So let's see, we don't have a quorum, but we do have someone from the city. So, well, if we don't have someone from the city and a quorum, we can't vote. Right, so that was what I was thinking about. So we've reached one of our goals. So I'm just gonna make the decision that we're gonna start the meeting, and the reason is because we have some folks this afternoon that are gonna need to leave early. There's a lot going on in the community tonight, so I do want to get us started. And if we suddenly have a quorum, then we will go back and do whatever we need to do with the quorum. But let's go on and take a minute and at least introduce ourselves. Lucinda, would you start, please, and just start the introductions and let people know what you're representing and what organization.
I'm Lucinda Shannon, and I staff this committee. I work for the Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission on Transportation.
Stephanie Yankson from ACOM. I'm working on the transit governance study.
I'm Curtis Garpinato. I'm with the Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission.
There we go.
My name is Mark Frank. I also am with ACOM working on the transit governance study.
Lloyd Snook, Charlottesville City Council.
Diane McKeel, Albemarle County Board of Supervisors. And now, Board of Supervisors, Waco District, thank you.
Al Morgan from Albemarle County, the JAUNT Rural Representative.
Ted Rick with John.
David Shackelford with the Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission and the Charlottesville Albemarle.
Christine Jacobs, Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission.
And we usually go the back row as well, so. All right.
Brian Davidson, Albemarle County Budget Office.
Okay.
Brian Davidson, CJPDC.
Trevor Henry, Deputy County Executive, Albemarle County.
Jessica Bruce Valerie, Community Development in Albemarle County.
Michael Barnes with VDOT.
Jen Fleischer with Blue Ridge Health District. Teresa Ward, TJPDC.
Great, thank you. Well, we appreciate everybody being here.
We want to do focus on Mark.
I'm sorry?
Do you want to do focus on mine as
Yes, so
well?
let's see who we have online.
We have
Those
Scott,
folks on Zoom, would you?
Scott Baker, who is not allowed to talk.
There he goes, promoted.
Stephanie's in two places at once.
So the folks that are on Zoom are
Mr. Baker, did you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Scott Baker with AECOM.
And Mr. Birchall? You might just be the public.
Hi.
Oh.
Hello?
Yes.
Oh, Wyatt Birchall with Piedmont Environmental Council.
All right.
And then there is Katie Miller
Yep, Katie Miller with DRPT.
and Sarah Pennington.
Hi, everyone. Sarah Pennington with Rideshare and the TJPDC.
Okay. That's it.
New
Welcome.
arrivals too.
Welcome. And we have,
Brian Kingston. I'm sorry.
that's okay, not a problem. And we now have a quorum, right?
And
Fantastic.
Oh, and
Hey.
yes. Hello.
Hi, I'm Kendall Howell from University Transit.
I didn't see you coming in.
No, that's not
Welcome,
true.
Kendall.
I'm an
Oh, this is great.
Madam Chair, hi, Ms. Miller, are you the official representative for DRPT on the meeting tonight?
Yes, Neil Sherman couldn't make it.
Good to know.
Good
Good to know. There we go. All right, thank you. All right, now what we can do then is go on and approve the agenda. I would entertain a motion to approve the agenda. Ann has made the motion. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, approval of draft meeting minutes from January 25th. Has everybody had a chance to take a look at the minutes? And if so, I will entertain a motion.
So moved.
Go ahead.
Move that we approve the consent.
Thank you, Hal. Is there a second? Ann is going to second. All those in favor of approving the meeting minutes from January 25th, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, so we have the agenda now and the meeting minutes, that's great. Do we have any members from the public that have signed up to speak, Lucinda?
We do not have anybody who has signed up to speak. However, if you would like to speak now, you can raise your hand or start speaking since you're both unmuted.
All right, I don't see anybody jumping in. All right, then we'll go right to the Regional Transit Governance Study update. So with that, Lucinda, would you like to do the introductions? All right.
Yeah, so when we did the Regional Transit Vision Plan, I'm sure you all will remember that. One of the recommendations was to do a Regional Transit Governance Study. And so we are doing the governance study. We were generously funded by DRPT, Albemarle County and the City of Charlottesville to do this study. We hired AECOM to do it. And the study is going to look at how we can increase the transportation pie and add to that so that we have enough revenue to implement the suggested services in the vision plan and add those services in. This study will help the region and the localities come to a consensus on what they want, how they want to govern transit in the region and how they want to spend the revenue if they do decide to increase additional revenue. This would not be revenue from the localities, it would be revenue looking at from the state and other sources. So we're not taking anything away, we're adding to the pie.
Thank you, Lucinda. And thank you all for being here. So what our plan for this afternoon is to give a brief overview of the project activities so far and have a short discussion session. So I think we can boil it down to a 25-minute presentation. Feel free to stop me in between to ask questions, and then a discussion time. And then we'll look at some next steps. So currently, just to remind us, Lucinda reminded us of the objectives of this study. The core objective is to identify potential governance models and potential funding, revenue generation schemes or strategies. Right now, we finished phase 1 and 2 of the study, which looked at existing conditions, which you've all had a chance to review. The memo, and also the peer study, which looked at peer governance structures around the country, looking at regions or systems similar to the Charlottesville region. In phase 3, which we'll be initiating now, we'll be looking at potential revenue generation. At this stage, we'll also be doing more one-on-one discussions with the localities to try to get some more feedback on their perspective in terms of what they want or need for transit and for their localities. Following phase 3, we'll go into now looking at the details of what alternative governance structures and then formulate some that are associated with funding as well. And so that's the general overview. Now for this afternoon, our discussion will cover first the existing legislation that we have. So in this region, there's existing RTA legislation, so a Regional Transportation Authority. We'll look a little bit more at the details of what that entails and get a better understanding on that. We'll also look at the peer governance structures to see the variety of models that other regions that are similar to the Charlottesville area are using, and begin that discussion of what are some pros and cons of applying some of those strategies in this area. We can also identify any funding issues that we anticipate, and also start discussing some of the goals we have for this region as well. So as part of phase 1, in looking at existing conditions, we looked at the CARTA, which is the Charlottesville Albemarle Regional Transit Authority, which is the existing legislation, which it's not operational, but that's what we have now. and compared it to some of the other Virginia models out there. So we looked at the MBTA, the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, Hampton Roads Transportation Accountability Commission, the CDTA, which is the most recent one from 2020, and then some other frameworks out there. So there's, for example, in the Public Transportation, Public Service Corporation model, as well as the District Commission model. Now, what I want you to notice, or from this, is discussing the details of what the CARTA legislation looks like and how it differs from some of the other Virginia models. And thinking about that, thinking about the goals we have for the Charlottesville region. And so for what we have now as a sort of a starting point is a legislation that allows us to form an authority with Charlottesville and all the parts of Albemarle County, all or portions of Fluvanna, Greene, Louisa, and Nelson County, including private nonprofit, tourist-driven agencies, higher ed facilities, public transportation agencies, and any other cities or towns that would want to opt in. And so it's very broad in terms of what the membership could look like. The composition is also of such a board is already prescribed. It would be 2 commissioners or representatives from Albemarle County and the City of Charlottesville each, and then 1 member from any other member community that decides to be part of this, and up to 4 non-voting members. I think the core issue with this legislation is that it doesn't provide any revenue generation mechanism. And so it provides for a structure to organize, to plan, to even operate transit, but then it doesn't provide for a means of dedicated funding. And so in looking at this, we can compare that now to some of the other Virginia models we have out there and see if moving forward, if we can, if the CARTA legislation is good enough for the goals that we have, or we would want to build on something else that we see in other parts of Virginia, for example, from MBTA, Hampton Roads, or CDTA, or even looking at some of the peer governance structures we looked at, identify what are some of the strengths that we would want to implement in this area. So just in comparison, and I hope you have the print out there, but some of the things that I'd like to point out, the details of this table here is a comparison of the CARTA legislation, which is for the Charlottesville-Albemarle area, compared to some of the other Virginia funding models. Now, some things that I would like to point out here is the board composition of the representation. We see that in the other.
Sorry, I'm printing more handouts.
In the other models, the other 3 models that have funding authority, that is your authority to levy some sort of tax or provide dedicated transit, their board composition also has a lot of state representation. So there's elected officials, but also there's state legislatures from different committees. There's a gubernatorial appointee, the commissioner of highways, depending on what the funding is. On the next page, we see that these entities were also approved for not only transit funding, but also broadly transportation funding with a transit component. And so even in thinking about what has worked well in Virginia, this is something that we could consider for this area if we want to be focused directly on transit only or want to go more broadly. What is something that the localities would be open to? What would meet their needs better? And how can we craft it in that sense? And so this CARTA legislation is just a blank, it's a starting point, right? And so there's different things that we can consider in moving forward. And once we get to phase 4, which is actually looking at potential governance models, is when we can now pick and choose, or not pick and choose, but identify the key priorities that we want in our scenario. The list here you see are some of the objectives we may want to consider. The current legislation lays out the membership and everything pretty straightforward right now, but that can also be modified if needed. And so not only do we have to think about how much, the level of funding we want to generate, but a way to think about that is to associate it with the possible futures we want. And like Lucinda mentioned, is building up on the transit vision study that we looked at, or that was recently completed, to identify what are the options or potential transit services that can enhance the lives of the people living here in terms of transit. We had the options of the constrained versus the unconstrained models, and everything in between, right? And so that gives us an idea of what are the different services that my locality can have, how can we increase it, in what way, and how much is it going to cost, and then that's where the question comes of how are we going to pay for it. And so thinking of that, thinking of what potential boundaries of the district might be. Would it be all or parts of certain localities? What is the appetite for that? What would a governing board look like? We see that the current legislation only has local representation, but like we've seen in most of the Virginia models, if we do want some sort of additional state tax or funding, we may have to include state representation. And so that's also something to think about. And then some of the other long lists that will come up, thinking about duplication of functions, operational effectiveness, when it comes to operations in the region as a whole. So these are some ideas to think about, and to begin the process of what would that legislation look like. And in that, the courses of action for moving forward to phase 4 would really be one of 3, right? The first would be completely start from scratch. Let's identify blue sky. What is our wish list, and then create what that entity would look like. Or we can start with the existing charter legislation that we have that is not in effect, but start with that and try to modify certain sections to match what we need and what we want. Or we identify some other model that we see elsewhere in Virginia. So the models like we talked about from MBTA or CBTA or a public service corporation, a transit district, some other model, and modify that for our region. And so those are the discussions we'll be having more and more, especially when we talk individually with the localities as well. So with that in mind, we also, after looking at the models in Virginia, we also proceeded to look at what other regions with similar characteristics to the Charlottesville area are doing and how they govern their transit. And so we had a set of criteria for selecting these peers. And some of the key things that we wanted to look at were, besides the operating characteristics, we also looked at the presence of a major university, and in cases where they had multiple agencies also operating in the same space. Now, the agencies that, I need to make that larger. The agencies we came up with, or the peer agencies, were in Ann Arbor, Iowa City, Bloomington, Blacksburg, State College in Pennsylvania, and Ithaca in New York. Now, for each of these agencies, we followed a very systematic process with a framework for assessing them, looking at their services, a brief history of how they evolved, their structure, their governance, particularly trying to talk a little bit more about their interaction with the universities, and or if there was presence of collaboration or some coordination with the other agencies in their region, and funding as well. So starting with Blacksburg, and the details of these are in a memo that you'll get to review very soon, and also in some of the handouts. But with these, for the purpose of time, I'll just point out some of the interesting things from each of the peers. with Blacksburg Transit, I think the most important thing here, it operates as a branch, a department of the city, so it's a city department. But the funding structure is set that Virginia Tech makes up majority of their local funding. And so although they're accountable to the city council, they approve all of their budgets and everything. The university actually is the major funder with very little funds coming from the local government. Now this probably evolved because of how the transit agency started out with a push really from the university rather than from the local government. And so the university was happy to continue to fund this way. Now, what this looks like is, in terms of their governance and making decisions for planning as well, is really between the staff and the university, talking about their priorities and coming to a consensus of how it's going to be funded. And so there's a lot of trust with the staff, working with the university as well, and that has been working well for Blacksburg Transit.
We'd like to point out, Kendall, that we really like that model.
Done. We're gonna do it. That's it. So do we have to rename the transit system too?
And in Bloomington, they set up as a municipal corporation, and that really is similar to a transit authority. It has the same powers that you would think of as a transit authority. It's very independent within the boundaries of the city. What is interesting here is that they also have a dedicated funding source, not only from their existing local property tax, but just recently, last year in 2022, the city passed a new tax that would provide additional transit funding at about $4 million per year, in addition to their regular property tax. And so they have a system where it's transit supported, but what really pushed this is pushing the idea of interesting or projects within the city that the public could really get excited about or back up for it. So even in thinking about our region, what are some of those regional projects that we could come up with to create that level of interest with the public, to get that level of support if needed as a potential way to increase the revenue? How do we communicate that to the public and make that something that can be, that could work in our benefit? They also have a very close relationship with the university system. So there's a separate university system, campus. They actually share a facility, a transit facility with campus. The transit agency owns the building and the university owns the land. And it's been like this for several years now. We spoke with the transit director there at Bloomington Transit, and he even talked about potential for them to merge in the future, to consolidate. And so they work very closely and they try to share some of these costs. And so we saw a very close relationship with the university, and we think that's something that we could think about how that would look in our region. What does it look like for UVA to have a closer relationship with the agencies here beyond what we already have? And so we can talk about, we can discuss some of those ideas as well. In Ann Arbor, Ann Arbor's situation is a little different. They weren't as close to the university. There's definitely collaboration there, but they are very independent in the sense of the way they operate, they plan, they make their decisions. It's also a transportation authority. They have their own, they levy a property tax, and they serve 3 jurisdictions. They have Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti, the city, and then the township. And they have all the regular powers of the transit authority as well. They also have some other agencies that work within the area. Like I mentioned earlier, they don't have a too close a relationship with the university system. But what is interesting here is, in addition to the local property tax that they have for the jurisdiction served by the transit system. There's an additional levy on the city of Ann Arbor. And because of that, they also have a supermajority on their board. But that gives them more funding to do the projects that they want to work on. They recently increased their property millage as well last year. And so there's an overall positive outlook on transit in that region. For Iowa City, their structure is similar to CAT in that they're a city department, similar to Blacksburg Transit as well. So they're a city department, they're accountable with the city council. They also contract out paratransit service to the county service. So they have what is called the Johnson County seats, and they operate the paratransit service and also other demand response service. So it's very similar to the situation we have with CAT in JAUNT, where JAUNT operates over a larger period. But what is interesting here is that there's a separate university system, campus, and they don't have a formal relationship, but they do interact in terms of some bus stops, some fare policy, and they do some long-term planning. However, interestingly, the director also talked about how in their regional plan, one of their priorities is to move towards a regional model for transit. And so they're starting to look at what would that look like between the campus system, Coralville Transit, which is a neighboring town, and the Iowa City Transit. Iowa City Transit, being a city department, interestingly also has a dedicated transit tax. They have a local property tax earmarked for transit. So that's very interesting in that it's not usually common it's not usually common with city departments. They also have, as a source of local revenue, they have this mixed-use transportation center that they rent out for retail or restaurants, and this is also a significant portion of their funding. And so that was interesting. They have apartment contracts as well. We saw this in another agency where they contract out service to student housing facilities and apartment complexes as a way of increasing their local, internally generated funds as well. In thinking about that, looking at the university system, what this region is like, is there a possibility of implementing some of those strategies here? Do we have a market big enough in terms of student housing, apartments, for some kind of contracted service with them as well? Or mixed-use development center that could also be a source of consistent revenue in addition to any other sources. These are some of the things that we can think about. The only, the disadvantage here though is that not really a disadvantage, but in the Virginia context, the agencies are not able to levy their own property tax, right? So it would have to be at the state level and legislation would have to be passed. So that's a difference in that. For example, between Ann Arbor's situation and here. Ann Arbor can have their own tax, but we would have to have some sort of state legislation passed for that. In Ithaca, New York, this was a very interesting pier because it's 3 agencies started in the 60s and 80s actually consolidated into one. So there was one for the city, one for the university, Cornell University, and one for the county. And they began consolidation very slowly. They actually started they set up an operating committee to identify what are some redundancies that can cut out, what are some of the efficiencies they can improve, personnel operations, etc. And then the next step was they moved into one facility and started sharing costs. And so they were still operating as usual, but then cutting down on some of those costs. A few years later, they had state legislation passed, but it wasn't until almost a decade before they entered into a joint venture agreement. And we were talking in our previous meeting that their situation is very unique in that they are organized as a nonprofit, a 501c3 nonprofit, because they weren't able to get the push they wanted from authority from the state level. And so because they did, there was that much interest and a need for them, they organized in this fashion through a joint agreement, and they've been operating since. In 2005, they adopted the branding for TCAT, and it's been working well for them so far. And so we see that even with the process of trying to consolidate or reduce some inefficiencies, it took a pretty long time and it was very systematic, but they were able to at least start somewhere before ending where they wanted to. And so even with us in our situation, we might have an end goal that we want to see, but it doesn't mean that we start at step 10. We can start at 1 and then move gradually towards what that future would look like. So a con here with Ithaca's model is that because they are set up as underwriters of this nonprofit organization that they fund, they have to fund it at equal amounts. They have a mortgage tax that comes in addition, but the localities also contribute. But because the way it is set up has to be equal, sometimes they have to go through periods of negotiation. Even if one jurisdictional locality is willing to pay more, the others have to come on board too. And so they talked about how this has sometimes been an issue with them. Finally, we looked at State College in Pennsylvania. State College is set up, CADA is set up as a joint municipal authority. Now, this is very similar to, in terms of powers and authority, to the CARTA legislation, which is the Charlottesville Albemarle Regional Transit Authority, because it has all the powers to operate and run and the regular authorities, the regular powers of an authority, but then it doesn't have the authority to levy a tax for their state law, which is very similar to Virginia as well. And so they still need the contribution, the local contributions from the localities and from the state and the state and the feds. They also have apartment contracts going on and a pretty sizable portion of their funds coming from Penn State as well. And so in many of the cases where we saw a close relationship with the university, we saw that the contribution from the university was very substantial. In some cases, upwards of $1 million. I think the lowest one we saw was about 600,000, but the rest were about 1.2 or 1.3 million in contracts from the university. And so that was a pretty substantial amount to help with their local contributions. And so, again, it got me thinking, like, what does that look like for Charlottesville? Like, how can we work together in such a way, or get to the point where there's either trust or need to identify the ways in which we could work with the university, if it's even possible. I think that's why you left, because I was going there. Oh, sure, also, okay. But like, what are some of the ways in which we could work together, like we see in some of these other regions where they work closely with the university and they're able to support them in this way. And they don't only, those agencies don't only provide the university service. In some cases, the universities have their own services, but they still have that contribution, that significant amount of contribution. So that's something that we can think about and consider. They also, in
exchange for open ridership.
Correct, yeah. Another interesting thing we saw in State College was them changing their contracts with the apartment buildings, or they're starting to think about changing it from a per ride basis, because during the pandemic, it dropped now to a per bed basis to make it more stable. And so that seemed very interesting in trying to stabilize their transit funding in a way. But again, State College is in the same boat that we are in here, in that they need the state to approve if they want to get a dedicated local tax. There is some discussion about some of the larger agencies in Pittsburgh and SEPTA wanting to lobby for them to be able to have a local tax, levy a local tax. So we'll have to wait and see how that goes. But in summary, what this table here is a comparison of just some of the key points of all the 6 agencies we looked at. And now thinking about what that looks like in our context. What are some of the things that we saw in each of the peers that we liked? And what are some things that we did not like and why? What are some of those things we think can be implemented or strategies that could work well for this region? But all the while, keeping in the back of our minds that in Virginia, there have been certain models that have worked well in the past. We have the examples from CBTA, MBTA, et cetera. So how do we merge those with the future that we want? And so even thinking about that, just some key takeaways that I think I've already mentioned throughout our discussion. One, what would the governing board look like? In Virginia, we know that we may have to have state representation on those boards to have a diversity on the board, just from experience with what we've seen in the other areas, versus in other places where they can have pure citizen boards and have no problem with levying, having the authority to levy a tax. In Iowa City, like I mentioned, is a city department, but they still have dedicated transit funding. So if the city, it's still something that we could look into about what would that look like if we wanted to go the route, some other route. We know what it would look like if we started with the CARTA legislation. Maybe that could be a stepping stone of having a level playing field where the different localities feel like they can all contribute equally to whatever system is provided for operating or planning the service. Even if before we get to the point of levying a tax or increasing some sort of revenue, what are some potential ways of organically increasing those local contributions if we were to start with what we have or modify it in some other way, knowing that it will be a process that will take some time. Like I mentioned before, the universities as well, looking at what that close collaboration would look like and inter-agency collaboration and coordination. So amongst the peers, we saw that between the neighboring agencies or some of the other agencies that provided different types of service, they had minimal coordination, but where it worked well, we could see it very strongly, like in Bloomington or in Ithaca, where they actually moved into the same buildings. What would that look like for this region? How do we, if there's a need, how do we improve that or increase efficiencies in that way? And lastly, what are some innovative regional projects that could create that increased interest for the localities here? That could be a potential way of talking about increased funding. What would that look like for each jurisdiction according to the goals that they have? And so what we won't have a breakout session like we did in the morning, but more of a discussion session, open forum. I think we have about 10 minutes or so, but if at this point, I'd like to open it up with questions or thoughts on one, maybe we can just start out with what we liked or what we didn't like, or what are the goals that we want for this region? If we are thinking about transit governance in this region, what goals do we want it to accomplish? I can start with one, which is we probably want dedicated transit funding, maybe, but what are some other goals that we might want in this region? And you can think about your localities too.
It seems to me that one goal would be to have a system that lets us do this, at least looking to the north. Or at least do the unconstrained network. To me, that would be a goal. Here we go. We want assuming we're to go down this route, metaphorically, if we had carpet, I think you called it, and it had teeth and it was able to actually, function as a authority or corporation or whatever, I mean, my hope would be that we would at least be able to accomplish this. Because otherwise I'm not really sure why we're doing it.
Yeah, very good, thank you. I think that's a good point.
Can you say a little more about, to me, the funding piece is what's really going to be, interesting. So let's just pretend that we have JAUNT and the JAUNT, this is just pretend. This is a thought exercise. Assuming you had CAT, JAUNT, and UTS all under one umbrella, how, given those assets and given funding streams that come from those three different organizations, I mean, how could we what would an ongoing financial model look like with those three? I think maybe that's the next part of your study, I'm not sure, but to me, I mean, CAT brings in a lot of the federal money, obviously, and then JAUNT has its sources of funding, and then the university is, that's the other thing for me with the university. I mean, your focus really is basically you get people from parking garages to their.
That's a very large percentage of our service hours are what most people would call parking lot shuttles. And so I don't know if your scope has that in it in terms of what federal funding and state funding and regional funding is able to pay for when it comes to parking lot shuttles, but I'd say that's about 40% of our service hours.
I think that's a really important point.
And so the question for us would be, could that be included in the umbrella, or would UVA still need to maintain the fleet and maintain those operations? Probably the latter, I suspect. But at the same time, the service that's run quite frequently through what everybody in this room probably calls student neighborhoods, 14th Street, Rugby Road, Preston, can it get high enough frequency and run the proper service hours such that it really does keep students from bringing cars to grounds? We do have a lot of data that shows that a lot of the students, by way more frequent behavior than everybody in this room probably, leave their cars at home and don't bring them because of the high frequency bus service. But then again, is the region ready to make that investment so that it truly is an option to not have a car? And then how about extending that courtesy to this network that would then say, okay, maybe an employee doesn't have to have a car either. And so those are just what comes off the top of my head. And I know I was super late. I also have to leave super early. So, but thank you. And Kendall, I'm sure you introduced yourself. So. Yeah, so thank you for the opportunity to say that. But I think the biggest thing would be, and I don't know if it's in your scope, about these parking lot shuttles, because everything I've read about federal funding and regional funding and state funding is that it's really not meant for parking lot shuttles. So go ahead.
But if those shuttles were part of the giant organizational operation and just funded by the university because you fund them today,
yes,
then that's another opportunity. It doesn't all have to come from
right. But I think there may be some stuff about the equipment that's used, like the rolling stock, that's used in there. You might not be able to share those fleets.
And CAT can share, so I don't know why they
I don't see a restriction in your model. I mean, if we were to serve a parking lot shuttle, as long as the vehicles are open to the general public, that would be permissible. If you were saying UVA students only.
Well, it's UVA
That-
permanent or something, like.
Right, but
employees,
if you're looking at
students.
a more expansive system, and there are precedents where transit systems do provide remote parking and shuttle. Des Moines, Iowa is one. I think.
Yeah, it's just something that the consultants will have to be sure to.
This is a really good conversation. But because in the interest of time, I want to bring us back out and look at the bigger picture. Because where you're going is where we all want to go, I think. But it's like a really big step. So what we were hoping to do is take smaller steps and get to there. That's like the end goal. But the middle beginning step, actually we're in the middle because we've already have an authority legislation and everything. One of the steps to get there, which is how we wrote the scope of work, is to look at bringing in additional funding and creating some type of organization, an authority, or something else that would have representatives from all of the participating jurisdictions and would have a system to make decisions around how that funding was spent. And that would be one step. And then we can continue going on. Now, we are flexible and we can change the scope a little bit and, talk more about, how we can merge agencies and all of that, but that's like a huge step.
But an important one to be thinking about,
Yes.
because that's what we're gonna need to make sure is written into the legislation, that the authority has the authority, that there is authority to do the things that we wanna do 10 years from now.
And I noticed that in some of the board compositions, there would be some leaps of faith for the university, which we are all brothers and sisters here. We all want the same thing, and that's what's really going to tie us together, is that we all want the same thing, which is to reduce single occupancy vehicle, to have transit be a true alternative to having a car, and so we all want those same things. So just keep that in mind, especially as we balance what really is a land use decision for UVA versus what's an investment for the region, and how does that express itself in the board composition and the funding decisions that come down.
And I guess the other question is, what is the region?
Yeah.
That's a big question.
Yeah.
Is it Louisa, Savannah, Nelson, or?
And that's the part that we have to work through with that steering committee, which is representation of all 6 jurisdictions, learning through the process, going through this study with us, to then determine if they have interest in being a part of an authority, and if so, what will the benefits be, mutual beneficial, and they may come to a decision to not be included, and then we determine, what the boundaries are based on the interest.
And that's going to depend on what they see is going to prevail, and I get that. I mean, that's.
So there
it could be a hub situation in the external counties instead of having every street covered up.
Oh, yeah. So this piece about talking with the various jurisdictions, that's later in this study?
Yes, there will be individual meetings with the consulting team and our staff with each of the jurisdictions individually to talk through, making sure that we're hearing not only what you guys need, but want, and what would this authority need to do in order for it to be something that you're interested in moving forward.
So Lucinda, you mentioned funding that can be brought to bear. What sorts of funding might be brought to bear beyond what JAUNT would contribute and CAT contribute and UTS would contribute?
I'll hand that over to our consultants.
I just wanted to call out one thing, and I don't want to interrupt the conversation, but I'm sorry I wasn't at the very start of the meeting. Peter Voorhees, I'm with the AECOM team. An interesting parallel I saw in the comparison between what could happen here and the 3 different regional funding authorities elsewhere in the state. There's a line that each one of them collects money and then distributes to operators. It's not the operator itself. And they're not necessarily, those ones are not necessarily just distributing for transit funding only. There are other transportation services that they're distributing for, with a share carved out for transit. So, that is still, we still have the opportunity to explore that as a model here. But the main thing is there's an entity that's raising funds and distributing it.
And Peter, just say more about what some of those sources would be? Just high level, what are some additional sources that was already coming in?
So state tax, sales tax that could be dedicated in different ways, right? In the state, what are the sources we're seeing in Virginia?
So for example, in the case of MBTA, they have a sales tax, they have a grand tax, they have a district, transportation district set up in NBT, in Northern Virginia that also does a fund transfer for transit. They have an interstate operations and enhancement program fund. In the case of Hampton Roads, they have the additional 0.7 sales tax that was a retail tax. They have a fuel tax. They receive.
Fuel, you said fuel? I'm sorry,
Yes, fuels. Wholesale, so this is at the state level. They also have the HOV tolls on some of the highways. Then they have the dedicated transit portion, which is the regional transit tax. So that was the recent one that was added that can come up to about $20 million annually from the state reputation taxes. So for CBTA, that was the most recent one in 2020. They have 0.7 regional sales tax, sales and use tax, and also a wholesale gas tax and potential for future tolls. So that's also made available.
And in the vision plan, we looked at CTA's funding model, and we put it onto the Charlottesville area, the MPO area, and we came up with that we could raise about $29 million a year in additional revenue for transit.
Using that model.
If we kept all of those assumptions.
Yes,
Using that model.
and the citizens pay those taxes.
So I guess my question is, again, I live in a world where I can't stand it when people want to jump ahead, you know, like there's a process, and I appreciate that. But one question I have about everything that you just mentioned was, and Lloyd, help me out here, I'm assuming all of that would require legislation.
Correct.
For us, it would, yeah.
From frankly, an administration or whatever that is anti-tax. And so my concern was a lot of the things that you just said is, I think that would be ideal, absolutely. And I think we would actually locally, we can't even get permission to do a 1 cent sales tax for our schools.
Right.
And so to me, I just think we need to think about or consider what is like politically feasible.
To be realistic.
Did any of your studies show a model that grabs money from parking? Is that crazy?
The example, it's not, but just looking at the examples we have, we looked at parking wasn't a major, but it doesn't mean it can't.
I mean, some of the peers it was.
You did
have one, Iowa City.
Oh, the peers.
Right. They did have an element where they funding from parking, but it was also from like apartments and things like that.
They have the apartments one, they have the transit facility where they have the parking. It wasn't a tax, but there's parking fees.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of tough though, especially with the fuel taxes and the parking fees, that if the goal is to reduce vehicle use and then we're trying to fund
It becomes
reducing vehicle
unstable.
use. Exactly.
Especially as you influence people's behavior to drive and park, it becomes unstable. That's what we found with mobility initiatives, is that if you tack it to the parking, then people, they react the way you want to, but then you don't have a predictable funding stream.
So the other
It's good.
The other idea is bake sales.
PTOs.
Lemonade stand.
One of the other, of course, is we're talking about funding and realistic funding that could be possible. And put that in addition to, are we going to talk about just transit or transportation? And it may be that the revenue stream would not be strong enough to do anything but transit. I'm just saying. Because if we start talking about, because if we talk about pedestrian or bicycle, we're suddenly diluting a pool of money that may not be real strong based on the state anyway, or the general assembly anyway.
So I guess as part of the scope of your study, I'm hoping that there's some, I don't know, risk analysis or whatever you want to call it, or probability of certain futures coming true versus others, and that could help guide us.
Yeah, I think a good indication of what could happen in the future is what has happened in the past. And so looking at some of those Virginia models and seeing what worked for them and how that went through the process is a good indication of what could also potentially happen here.
Yeah, I'd be very interested in understanding more how they pull that off, because we can't even get a sales tax to fund our schools.
Construction of schools.
Yeah.
The 50-year-old
That's pretty frustrating.
And CVTA in Central Virginia, it's just 15% of that funding that's set aside for transit. And many people in the region feel like it should be a higher percentage. But it's just a small percentage, and transportation is it's every party, right, is interested in transportation.
Yeah, in the three other models, all the funding was for roads and transit. With the transit component, transportation,
So, but that's a decision we could make,
the
is
transportation.
that if it's gonna be transit and transportation or just transit. And that's my understanding.
Yeah.
So say, again, if I'm jumping ahead of Phil's process, I'm sorry. Say you meet with all your stakeholders and everyone from the various jurisdictions are like, yeah, sign this up, we want to be a part of this. And I'm glad we have this legislation that exists. That's pretty cool. And we all come together. I guess that group of people could say, we want to dedicate a certain amount of our general funds from our locality to subsidize this, or we could pool our efforts and have federal dollars brought straight to us as opposed to going through. So those are all things that could happen, I guess.
Correct.
That seems more like a possibility.
One of the localities, I believe, raised some money through a referendum.
Correct.
And taking it to the citizens.
Does that still have to go to the state?
In Virginia.
We have to have the authority to do that, and there's no guarantee, but,
Any of you are really negative, I'm sorry.
No, we went in like 2010 and asked, and they said, no, we're not going to give you permission to have a referendum and ask your citizens if they want to pay a little gas tax to use for your local transportation.
As you hope.
They can always hope. The circles come back.
Chair McKeel,
Yes.
Mr. Henry, I had a question.
Oh,
And
sorry.
Actually,
I'm sorry.
The question was asked, really, is about the inventory of potential funding sources, and if there's any now that we have the enabling authority to utilize. Sounds like the majority of them would be requirements of the state to provide that.
Yes.
Yeah, and the next phase of this study is now looking deeper into that question of what are those potential revenue sources. So we have more information about that.
I'm just curious about something, and this, I'll freely acknowledge my ignorance here, and it'll probably be abundantly clear once I ask my question. I noticed that Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, Hampton Roads, Central Virginia Transportation Authority, all talk about them having a responsibility for transportation, and they distinguish between transportation and transit, which I assume therefore means that transportation is to include roads, road construction. Does it include road maintenance?
Yeah, I'll have to double check. But I assume so.
It seems like, I think that I know I've been told, whether I remember correctly, that counties rely on the state for a lot of their road maintenance. Is that right? All of them. Okay. So it seems like Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, Hampton Roads, Central Virginia Transportation Authority would be primarily cities rather than counties.
I think there's an extra layer here. The NOVA layer is an extra taxing district on top of what the counties do. And Arlington and Henrico are the other two that do their own code. Because they got into that charter thing 50 years ago.
Okay.
They get paid $16,000 a mile, whereas we were offered $1,000 during the last disaster. So
My point is that if we start talking about what we would be doing to include transportation, we're gonna have an apples and oranges
Yeah,
problem.
we're
Yeah.
mixed bag, yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
That's true. So that's one of the, I guess in framing it as like a goal for what a potential structure would look like, or what that umbrella agency would look like, how would you phrase that? If you were to think about it.
Well, you know, just thinking about the issue that we talked about at noon, you know, Louise is saying, what's in it for us? Maybe one of the things that, for them at least, might be some greater attention on roads and road maintenance and things that are more important to them than perhaps our needs that are not being met by the state, or at least needs that they don't have control over. So if we're sort of thinking about things that could be attractive to them, maybe one of the things we would end up with is some understanding that there would be some freedom on the part of Louisa to handle certain needs of theirs that maybe the city wouldn't have. And just have,
That flexibility.
that sort of thing.
One thing that seemed to be very positive from the chart on page 4, where the slide said that the more successful ones did have a lot of legislators on that. This is essential because we don't, and they just don't pay any attention. It's like the River Basin Commission's Rappahannock has like 10 legislators, and they get loads of state money, and Ravenna has none, and we don't get any. So I think that's a true key to handling our situation.
The state delegate on the board, is that?
No, we need them, but we don't have that.
But
it's
the
a
models that
reality,
are successful do.
even beyond the legislature is the Department of Rail Public Transportation,
Right.
the CTV member, and like the decision, you know, the other state connections beyond just legislators.
Yeah.
And I think that's definitely,
Now let's need to bring in as many counties as you possibly can.
As long as they're all focused on the same thing. There is
Well,
a
then
hazard in
having-
having people who don't want to do what the rest of it is for, in which case that's what VDOT should be doing.
Well, that's why you need a chicken in every pot scenario, like the Mayor Snook was talking about. And you allocate certain amount of funds for certain purposes to certain jurisdictions in order to get their vote. And if you scale back the transit plans, right now the region spends locally, I would say around $10, $11 million in local money for transit. So maybe if we went to 15 or 16 million, that still leaves 13 million on the table for road projects.
so some flexibility.
No problem with flexibility on both sides. If you want to get more money for transit, maybe not all what you want, you may have to build Louisa some roads. I get that.
I was just looking at the Blacksburg chart, and it shows that basically 28% of their money is coming from Virginia Tech, which would be, and add another 1% with Christiansburg contract or something. But thinking about local contributions of roughly 30% versus state and federal of roughly 70%, taking your 10, 11, $12 million locally and trying to figure out what we would need from state and federal, how do we get that additional state and federal? I mean, where does that money come from? How do we go about it?
On the federal side.
Does it come to us amazingly just because we declare ourselves?
On the federal side, I think you're kind of maxed out because the urban portion of our federal money is based on population. That's it. The rural population that we get is based on some sort of performance indicators. So they make it a little bit, if you expand it on the urban side, I don't think we can get much more than we should have.
How would increased ridership affect that?
I don't think it would at all.
Even if
Because
we combine
the allocation,
universities.
I'm not talking about, I don't want to get too in the weeds, but the base allocation that CAP gets is strictly based on population factors. Now, bigger communities, ridership and revenue do have a factor, but we're not big enough to hit that set criteria.
So even if we had combined university and civilian ridership, we still wouldn't qualify.
I don't think we would get any more federal.
On the federal, you're right, but on state.
Well, state maybe, I don't know about the state.
The state operating formula does it.
Okay, I don't know about that.
There was that was one of the discussions with university, is being able to get some of their ridership would increase the funding from the region.
No, but that's the state,
Right, it would be
Yeah.
the state.
On the federal side, I don't think, I think we maxed out on federal.
Well, basically, almost all of these, Blacksburg, Iowa City, Ann Arbor, whatever, are getting somewhere around 50 to 70% of their money from state and federal sources.
Well, if you put everything together here, the city is, I think, getting about 70% of its expenses met by federal and state, and we're getting about 40%. So if you do the math, our budget and gas budget are about the same. If you were to normalize it, it's probably close to 50%, 60% here, federal, state, and the rest is local. So we're getting about 10, 12 million local. Our combined budgets are about $24 million. So if you're getting about 10 million local, I can't do the math real quick, but it's probably,
Even the unconstrained proposal was going to be cost something like $38 million.
well, you want the constrained one, don't you?
I'm sorry, other way around. Constrained one was 38, the unconstrained was 76. And I'm just thinking, okay, we
You
get
have to
38.
scale that back, something more reasonable.
But you can go in between. I mean, it doesn't have.
I understand, but I'm just trying to think,
Sub-constrained.
you know, the issue for me is, if we're looking at $10 or $12 million now, and we're looking for a project for a total cost of $38 million, I mean, I'm not sure how that all works out, but I assume that a fairly significantly larger chunk would be required from state or federal in order to keep these things in balance, but you're saying that's really not likely.
On the federal side, as far as I can tell, we're pretty well maxed out. State, I don't know about.
On the state, it really depends on the performance of all the other transit systems in the state too. So if our ridership goes up and the size of our system goes up, the funding that we're putting into our system goes up, we should go up. But if everybody else in the state is doing the same thing, then it's
There may be some savings. There's a couple of issues. One, if we do combine the systems, I don't know what our respective overhead rates are. It might be possible to reduce overhead, and therefore that becomes a resource that can be put on the street. So that's a possibility, but that would have to be looked at as a combined kind of a system.
Well, I'm not looking for a complete package worked out today, but I was trying to get a sense of the order of magnitude of the problem.
So something similar occurred in Indiana and Bloomington, where they wanted to combine the systems a couple of years ago, but it was because their state funding would have gone up significantly, suffering from the other operators. There was immense lobbying from the other operators in the state, and they stopped it. But now the state formula has since changed, and so they're going to move forward with that direction of trying to consolidate again. But what's interesting is that the director, now the CEO at the Bloomington Transit, was part of the opposition during that time. Trying to stop it. Yeah, so.
And now it's all in favor of it.
So Stephanie, I'm the official timekeeper, so I'm just wondering, what do you need from us today, other than the discussion that we just had?
Yeah, I think that feedback and getting your thoughts, because this is just the beginning of the discussion. And so we appreciate all of your comments. We've taken good notes, and there'll be more of these coming up so that we can talk more about it. The next phase of this study is looking at the potential revenue generation. So this is where we get into the weeds of looking at what is possible here in Virginia. We'll conduct our individual discussions with the jurisdictions as well, and then move into phase 4, where we look at now what governance scenarios could match the kinds of funding we're looking at.
Well, it was a great discussion. Does anybody have anything they really want to add before we move to the next?
If you don't mind, I just thinking about that whole idea of expanding the advocate care to rural areas for transportation. I don't know quite how those things work with the other authorities. They tend to be a little more urban and smart scale, and to be multiple needs. Usually in the counties that around you, smart scale is addressing the safety needs, but it's a little bit smaller sort of a pool of projects, maybe in comparison to some of these other jurisdictions you're talking about. I think what they're using their money is matching and buying down the smart scale costs and making the cost benefit better. I think that's the way those ones work. You might want to, if you're going to like create a carrot for them, you might want to make sure you understand all the dynamics of
Sure,
how the
yeah.
carrot works. Because it may not be the carrot you think it is.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yes.
We need a really good acronym. That part is really important.
A good ABC.
Yeah.
Well, card is pretty cool, that's me.
Yeah.
We don't look at cars before the horse, though.
If we would, then we could call the unconstrained option the magnet car.
Stan, can I add, if anybody in processing all this has additional thoughts, please pass them on to our staff so that we can give them back to consultants. If you're thinking of something, put it in writing in an email and let us put that as a letter.
And Lou said it would be the fourth person.
And just one process question for you to think about is how to carry out these sort of local check-ins. If this is Florida Cola, as opposed to individual conversations, I personally love to hear what other people say, because it helps me to figure out the right questions, more questions to ask. So I don't know if that's something you're considering, or if you're trying to do individual conversations, which would be.
Yeah, so in between the individual discussions, we'll have more workshops, like we had this afternoon. So we have 3 more coming up in the summer.
Group.
So,
Yeah.
group, yeah, with a group, so it'll be in addition.
Yeah, and sharing out the comments and questions, I think, would be helpful to the group.
Okay.
If we could, you know, I think.
Sure.
that's- All right, so, in an effort to keep us going. Transit provider updates. Next on our agenda. Ted, you're the first kickoff here, so do you have any updates for John?
Not really, we've been knee-deep in the FY '24 budget, which, you know.
You did a great job with that.
Oh, I wasn't very confident with him anyway. So, but no, it's just been all-consuming for the last few months here, so hopefully we'll get past this and do some other interesting things.
So how is your driver challenge right now? I will ask.
I think we're doing all right.
Okay, that's good. Good. All right, Charmaine called me just a little while ago and said she was ill and could not come this afternoon. Albemarle County Public Schools, she did say that they're continuing to work on driver shortage and recruitment and.
We're doing terrible with drivers.
Yeah. So, all right, how about, I started to turn it back up, but of course, you know, all right.
You guys all heard about Becca's retirement in June.
Yes.
Okay, so there's that. We're currently in what we would call full service, spring 2023 service. We switch over to recess service, which is slightly reduced on May 2nd. That's when we kind of switch over. And so we'll go to summer, try to do our big recruiting and training segment, then that's kind of the UTS overview for now.
And just again, same question, how are you doing for drivers?
We're doing okay. We're tracking about 18%, 15% down, which is better than the 25 or 30% down that we have been.
Right.
And so we're slowly getting there. Yeah.
Is your recruitment including student drivers?
It does, and it always has. We just, they just don't need to have jobs like they used to.
Yeah.
Access UVA.
Yeah.
I guess.
Mom and daddy.
Yeah.
Okay, and then Garland, who is here? Oh, I guess,
You
I
call it
wasn't
City of
sure.
Charlottesville.
Yeah.
I believe Garland and JAUNT are currently at the state rodeo in Petersburg, so they're
Oh,
competing.
yeah.
Our drivers are competing against other drivers around the state on how well they drive and how well they know the different parts of their bus. The big project that we have going with CAT right now is our alternative fuel study. We're looking at different scenarios for different potential fuels to move to from diesel. Our consultant right now is looking at all the potential costs that are associated with each of those fuel types, as well as benefits in terms of emissions and health. We will be rolling out some of those different scenarios and the results over the next month or so to get some feedback from stakeholders on which fuel we want to go with.
Okay, so at some point it'd be interesting for this group to have that.
Yep.
Next meeting.
Okay, so the agenda, that's great, thank you. Anything else?
In terms of drivers, I think we're still in the same state. We also are missing a few front office staff at CAT, so we have some positions to fill.
Vance, I think it's worth noting for CAT too, that the RFP for microtransit was issued on Friday.
Oh, great.
That's
That's great. And that's the Albemarle County micro transit pilot that we will be doing, so the RFP is out there. That's great.
How many vehicles are in the pilot? I'm sorry if everyone.
No, go right ahead, that's part of the.
I think 6 vehicles set aside, they're buying a chassis that they're planning on using. I don't know that they'll all be out on the street at the same time supporting that microtransit, but I think that's part of what they're trying to determine through the RFP is how that will operate.
Please let us help a little bit. We've been through the school of hard knocks a little bit with our state ride program, so let us help.
So the pilot concentrates. Yeah, and the pilot concentrates on the Pantops area in 29 Ward.
Yeah.
So just so everybody knows.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Population centers.
All right, that's good.
Yeah. All right, and then we're to Katie Miller from DRPT.
Yeah, so you didn't give me any specific updates to provide, but we have finished up all of the internal scoring for grants on our end, are finalizing the SIP now.
Right. News, that's right. And then we'll move on to staff updates.
Sarah's on.
Oh, Sarah's there. Sorry, Sarah.
Yeah, so sorry I couldn't be with you guys in person. I was out doing park and ride inventory today. We do quarterly inventory for rideshare, and then VDOT has also asked many of the areas to take on doing some more extensive infrastructure inventory of those lots. So the timing just didn't quite work out. So big Afton news. Obviously, last time we met, I told you about the new schedule that was going to be rolling out in February, and now it's the end of March. So we have rolled that out. We do have some February numbers to report back to you. The average ridership for the month of February was 58 passengers per day. So that was actually up just a little bit from those January numbers, and pretty on par with what we were seeing at the end of last fall. So we haven't seen any big jumps yet, but we are still doing a lot more marketing and promotion to make sure that folks are aware of those new times and stops with that route information. The folks at Central Shenandoah Planning District Commission, which the Afton Express is their demo grant, have also asked me to pass along that they are starting to look at forward planning for the service, which is always a good sign. We've just been too on top of things, and we've actually been able to implement almost all of the things that were in the initial plan for the service, which is a terrible problem to have, obviously. So with that said, they are looking for any feedback, any suggestions, any thoughts of potential things that could be implemented in probably a 5-year plan that they will set down to do. On their radar, obviously, is the new park and ride lot for the Crozet area. I do know we still have a couple of years before that becomes or comes completely to fruition and to in the building stage, but they do have that on their radar to be considering in those 5-year plans, that once that lot is open, that they are looking at possibly implementing that into the route as well. But any more ideas, we would be happy to take that into consideration as we move forward in that planning. So if you have any, you could just email or call me directly, and I would be happy to make sure that those get into consideration for future plans.
I have a question, Sarah. On your commuter routes, are there enough empty seats right now coming over the mountain that if the JAUNT runs can scoop up people in their neighborhoods in Crozet and bring them to the express that's going by, that the JAUNT bus wouldn't have to keep going all the way to town and back, and you could fill up your seats? Is that even a possibility, in which case you and Ted could think about it?
That is a great question, and definitely something that I'm pretty sure that they kind of have on their radar to maybe look at. My guess is about the enough seats is it would probably very much depend on which Afton Express routes, that varies. Some are more popular than others, and that probably would also vary depending on those connect routes their timing and how many folks that they are picking up. But I do know that they have been in contact with JAUNT initially about that and have it on their radar to keep those conversations rolling as we look at that lot and how it can best be utilized. You know, one of the things that we certainly are very aware of and don't want to do is create too much redundancy and be inefficient with the resources that we have. We want to make sure that, you know, we're serving as many people as we can within the resources that we have. But that is a good point of kind of making that a little bit more of like a circulator to connect folks to that area. Mm-hmm.
Where is the Crozet Park and Ride located? I'm sorry, I'm new.
Patterson Mill Road, right at the foot of 107.
Okay.
Yeah. So a little bit more central to, you know, stopping as a quick stop off of 64, which was kind of the issue, is that we didn't have anything available when the AFTA was first put together to be able to make those stops.
Sarah, I have some fare card ideas that I'll pass.
Okay.
On.
Awesome. We would love to hear that. Please, Kendall, just send them directly to me and I'll make sure that they get passed on in those planning meetings that we'll be having.
On it.
Thank you, Sarah. All right.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Sarah. And Sandy, you're next.
Yes, we have a lot going on in the MPO right now. So the first thing I'll start with is the long-range transportation plan. We are in the process of kind of just starting to ramp up for some public engagement for that. We developed a list of our goals and objectives. We held 3 different stakeholder group meetings in February to get some initial feedback from different stakeholders. And so we'll be finalizing that language for recommendations and review by the MPO committees next at their next set of meetings in May. And then we'll be preparing for public engagement over the summer and meeting with lots of community groups and attending events and that kind of thing. We also have finished a project prioritization process. So this is just to develop the methodology that we're going to use for the evaluation of where our system needs are. So we haven't identified what the system needs are yet, but this process will help us facilitate sort of a quantitative analysis that will match up against the public feedback that we're getting as well to help us sort of paint a picture of where are the priorities for where we need to focus on transportation improvements. And then we are also working on developing a project website, so that should be up probably in the next month, so that as we start this public engagement, we have a good resource to direct people to where they can see all the information. We have 2 federal grant updates. The first is that, as I think you all have been notified, we were successful in receiving the Safe Streets and Roads for All grant. So we have been meeting with the US DOT and going through a lot of our kickoff meetings and reviewing our grant agreements and things like that. So we are going to be working with all of the localities just to review the scope of work that we submitted as part of the grant application, and then we'll go ahead and move forward in preparing an RFP to get some consultants on board in order to start moving forward on developing these safety action plans. As I think we're all aware, it feels like we're hearing a lot of information about some of these safety outcomes recently, and so I think this feels a lot more, the significance of this is resonating with me very personally at this point, just because of the news that I feel like keeps coming out. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to find some good strategies to reduce the news that we're hearing. We also submitted a RAISE grant application to fund the preliminary engineering phase of the Urbana River Bicycle and Pedestrian Bridge. So basically, we, after having a conversation about it, there were just too many unknowns for the project to be competitive for funding. The contingencies were really high because it's in a project that is in a potentially sensitive area. There's a lot of potential mitigation that may need to happen. So we really determined we needed more information in order for us to be able to better estimate the construction costs of that project. So I'm very thankful to VDOT for getting behind this and doing something a little bit different than they've done before and working with us to scope out the project. So we will find out at the end of June if we were successful in that grant award. And then other business that is happening right now in the MPO is we are working on the development of next year's Unified Planning and Work Program to identify what our tasks are going to be that we'll be undertaking. We've also started a discussion about preparing for the next round of smart scale projects. So just so you all know, we are not actually done with round 5 yet. There have been staff recommended scenarios for projects funded, but those are subject to change based on any sort of feedback from the Commonwealth Transportation Board. So those selected projects would be finalized when the 6-year improvement program is adopted by the Commonwealth Transportation Board in June. Yeah. And then the other thing that I mentioned to this group specifically is that DRPT had reached out to our MPO and requested that we provide a letter of support for a corridor, forget what it was called, a corridor improvement plan or a corridor, what is it?
Corridor identification.
Thank you for reading your packet, Ben. A corridor identification project to look at the east-west passenger rail between the Hampton Roads area going all the way to Southwest Virginia. And one of the things that they're looking at is potentially looking at the feasibility of a future direct connection between Charlottesville and the Richmond area. So we, the NPO, provided a letter of support for that project, and we're all crossing our fingers and toes that it'll be successful.
And just a little bit about corridor identification. So this is an FRA program. It's really related to Infrastructure Act funding for intercity passenger rail around the country. And if you get in, it's $500,000 to create a plan for what comes next, and potentially infrastructure money behind that to make some real improvements.
Yeah. And we are right on the line between there and there.
Yeah.
Excellent.
That's
it? Okay. All right. Any questions for Sandy or for anybody else? No. I will just let folks know that Albemarle County continues to work with VDOT, DRPT, as well as CAP on trying to get approvals for shelters and pads in Albemarle County on VDOT roads and right of ways. The Department of Governmental Services has to approve all the permits for every shelter that goes on every VDOT road. It appears that they look at putting transit shelters just as if you were building a house, but without the bathroom and kitchen. 3 feet from the roadway. We continue to work with that in DRPT. I think, I don't know if Katie wants to add anything, but certainly my information from Jim DeBrule at DRPT is that there are counties all over the state of Virginia who are just as frustrated as we are in Albemarle County. They are trying to work the process, but it is a big ship and it's taking a long time to turn that ship, so.
So sample shelters are on the way, basically.
Well, yeah, I don't know that they're, well, we'll see, we hope. Everybody has their prototype, but the problem is that those prototypes right now haven't been flying very well with the Department of Governmental Services, so we'll see.
So should a bathroom in these things?
Well, we should put a kitchen and a bathroom,
Okay,
perhaps,
all
to
right.
increase our chances, yes. With that, unless anyone else has any new business, it is 5:30, and I know some people do have other things they have to get to this evening, and you all have never objected if we.
And I'm not going to start now.
All right, exactly. So, hearing no objections, then I will adjourn the meeting, and our next meeting is scheduled for April the 22nd, same place, same time.
Great.
So thank you very much. Thank you. All right. And Stephanie, we will here very much. Thanks to all of you all. It's great. Very interesting.